Hi, everybody. Today, thanks to the Polar Vortex, we're going to talk about Tuesday's class on Thursday. And the subject of this class is the relationship between New France, or the French Empire in North America, and Native peoples. Now, the last two classes we talked about the idea of Native New World, that is, the interior part of North America, and how it was being transformed in the wake of colonization and trade on a global scale, even though native peoples in the interior didn't necessarily have contact all the time with colonists and empire. We talked about the sort of transformations that native peoples underwent, the way their societies were being reorganized, and this is a prime opportunity for us to talk about this in the context of the French Empire. The map that you're looking at now is a map produced by the French Empire, which lays claim to the territory the King of France claimed by right of discovery in New France. In other classes, we've talked about the ideas of a right of discovery, but one of the important things that underpins the claim that the French make is that they're claiming a territory that is way more vast than the territory occupied by their actual settlers, which really constitute a series of small settlements linked from Quebec to Montreal on the St. Lawrence Seaway. But the thing about New France that makes it really handy for discussing Native history is the way that the French handled their relationships with Native peoples. It was very much a stark contrast with the English colonies along the eastern seaboard. And that is, New France uh, understood that in order to maintain any sort of claim for this vast territory, they would need to have a relationship with Indian peoples. And that relationship was structured around the relationship between Onondio, that is the name that the native allies of New France called the governor. Each successive governor took on that same name, Onondio, and really the persona that came with it. Onondio was the father of the French father to native Indian allies. That's not a particularly good map. Let's look at this map. So that when the people who claimed an alliance with New France understood their relationship, they understood it in terms of this father-child relationship. Now, the French quickly moved into this role of a French father, and they embraced it with eagerness because the French system was a patriarchal system, where the father was the head of a household. When native peoples proposed the structure of Onondio as a father to native children, they did so because their understanding of what a father did and what his responsibilities were vastly different. As we've discussed before, leadership in village communities stemmed from ability of a leader to provide for the people in his immediate family, his extended family, his larger village community. And that is how they saw the role of a French father in an alliance, providing for his children, so that the relationship was looked upon not in a sort of infantilizing sort of way by which native peoples thought themselves to be uncivilized and immature, but in terms of how you would structure a relationship within a larger family. This is the conception that both sides brought to the table, but both sides had different understandings about the responsibility and role of the father. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a large part of the relationship also came from the displacement and disruption of allied nations like the Wendat Confederacy that you're seeing here, who began suffering raids from the Iroquois, began suffering internal dissension over disagreements about the acceptance of Christianity, suffered from epidemic disease, so that by 1650, large numbers of the Huron Confederacy had fled inward to villages in the Great Lakes, in Mackinac, along the western shore of Lake Superior. And in these villages, they merged with other people, Anishinaabe peoples, that we would now think of as Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe, all who clustered in villages from Sault Ste. Marie, Mackinac, Green Bay, various lakeshore communities that were really sort of the travel points along a kind of emerging trans-regional economy that brought furs from the deep interior to the coastal towns for trade. Now, trade and alliance were pivotal to this relationship between New France and its native allies, and so was the relationship within the allies, the clustering in villages of Algonquin peoples like the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the Odawa, with newer refugee arrivals, Huron, Wendat, various other peoples from the east who've been displaced both by English settlement far to the coast and also by Iroquois raids into the French territories that caused the Wendat to flee. The alliance with New France was then structured on the basis of the French governor acting as a father, helping these multi-ethnic communities come together and sort of act cohesively in a way that was difficult because they were, as I said, lots of different communities now clustered in single villages. And in many ways, what the French governor and the French Empire was able to do was to provide a backbone or a sort of glue that allowed a whole lot of different village communities, both with regular migrants, with regular seasonal migrants, and with refugees fleeing from the east, to come together and act as a unified alliance system on the basis of their relationship to New France. Now, the glue that held all this together was the fur trade. You can't really disentangle the French alliance with native peoples from the French fur trade. As we discussed in previous classes, the fur trade was a means by which people created ongoing relationships with one another. So the exchange of goods, the exchange of trade goods for beaver skins, the exchange of food, the exchange of other commodities created a condition that anthropologists call reciprocity. We create an environment in which people expect that they have to repay debts that are given. They give gifts in order to ensure that people will come back to get repayment for that gift. The fur trade very much functioned in this fashion, and the French were able to utilize the fur trade not only to great economic benefit, but as a sort of social glue that kept their allies linked to them, so that the trade and the alliance system became synonymous in New France. You couldn't separate one out from the other. And in this sense, you can't really take the politics of the French Empire out of its trade relationships. They could never make it a solely economic one based on the rationale of supply and demand. It was always about creating obligation and commitment between a French father and the Indian children that were part of the alliance system. Now, in this alliance system, as I mentioned before, 1650 is a watershed moment. It's the time when the French allied Indians, the Huron, uh, leave their territory in the Ontario Peninsula and move into villages in the west. By 1660, another pivotal moment, the Iroquois make peace with New France. They do so in part so that they could turn their attention to the south, raiding. There's the Iroquois Confederacy that you can see stringing out from the Mohawk River, along the Mohawk River, the Hudson's Bay River. As they turn their attention into the south, they're raiding into the Susquehanna and Delaware territories along the eastern seaboard. During the 1660s, as they push into the Delaware and Susquehanna territories to get access and control of the trade routes that come from New York, as a counterbalance to the trade routes that are moving up along the St. Lawrence Seaway with the French in the north. These are the two main gateways through the fur trade into the west. By 1680, with the sort of conquest of these southern trade routes completed, the Iroquois returned their focus to the French territory and their competition with French and the French allied Indians in the west, so that you have renewing of conflict by the 1680. The other pivotal thing that happens in 1680 that makes this a real benchmark year is it marks the time period when the French fur trade itself begins to move west. Up until this point in time, the French allied Indians would arrive in Montreal in caravans annually. So at the spring, when the Great Lakes became unfrozen, the waterways opened up, you would have huge caravans that moved from village to village as they moved all the way out from the west end of Lake Superior, through Montreal, through Mackinac, and making their way up the St. Lawrence Seaway, so that you would have literally hundreds of people in canoes bringing massive amounts of fur in on an annual basis. These became obvious prime targets for Iroquois raiders who would move up from the Iroquois territory in what is now upstate New York to try to block off these communication highways that linked Montreal and the French colonies with their Indian allies in the fur-bearing regions of the Great Lakes. This became both a source of conflict and war, but it also eventually resulted in the trade moving west. And by that I mean traders from Montreal, in part to avoid Iroquois raiders, but also in part to get quicker and better access to goods, began taking their trade into the native villages in the interior. So by 1680, you had French people roaming the interior, most of whom were not licensed. Now, the French trade system required traders to have a license. There were licensed traders in the Great Lakes, but there were also large numbers of independent traders, what the French called coureurs du bois, or runners of the woods, people operating without a license. These traders could often be the source of trouble because they traded in their own interests rather than on behalf of the government. And as the trade moved west, the stability that had come from the alliance system linking French allied Indians with a French father and creating a sort of unified system of trade and alliance making was fractured by the existence of all these independent traders. As I said, they didn't necessarily trade with the interest of the empire in mind, and they often would push into territories that were occupied by people who weren't part of the allied system. People like the Sioux, for example, or the Cree to their north. And in trading with Indians who weren't allied to New France, many of the French allied Indians began to think of this as a betrayal. And the documents that you're going to be asked to read this week deal with these issues. How you understand trade relationships and alliance making, and how you punish wrongdoing, how you distinguish between wrongdoing among allies versus wrongdoing between enemies. We're also going to look at the nature of this thing that the historian Richard Wright has called the middle ground. That's the middle space between how the French understand the world and the native peoples understand the world, and how in coming together they end up creating something that is unique and new. This is another important part about studying this region in the interior, is that rather than thinking about the sort of standard tropes of Indian history, that you either have heroic resistance or tragic defeat, we have a more complicated system where native peoples and Europeans neither can get the upper hand, and they're forced to sort of come together with some mutually comprehensible understanding of how the world works and what their relationship to one another will be in the new world. This rolling conflict that expands as the fur trade moves west is obviously exacerbated by the expansion and the push of Iroquois traders in competition with the same area. The Iroquois are working with British trading partners in the British colonies. They're pushing west and increasingly competing for the same sort of territories where furs are being processed and hunted. This eventually leads to something to the extent of total warfare, where you have raids between villages, between the Iroquois Confederacy villages and French allied villages that go back and forth at horrific cost, not only in terms of competition for furs, but increasingly in terms of competition for captives that are being taken to reincorporate into communities as they suffer population losses, in part because of the warfare, but also because of disease. So between 1680 and 1700, you have a massive escalation of intertribal violence, fueled by the English and French empires, who are spurring on that violence in a quest to control furs and the fur trade. This eventually leads in a peace in 1701 between the French Empire, the allied French Indians, and the Iroquois Confederacy. That peace of 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal, is a watershed moment also in the early empire. It does bring a close to the massive warfare over struggle for beaver trade, but it also refocuses the French into that borderland region between the allies in the eastern interior, or the western interior, and the Iroquois Confederacy. You can think of that space between Lake Erie and the Ohio Country rivers as a border between the Iroquois Confederacy and Indians west of that. The French pour all their resources into there. They create Detroit at this time period to manage those relationships. And as a consequence, they sort of take their eyes off the prize in the west. And the west becomes a place where trade becomes completely disentangled from empire. And the allegiance of Indians in the west becomes weaker and weaker, so that by the time you reach the 7 Years' War, the French aren't able to call a massive array of allies from across the trans-regional spaces of the upper Mississippi Valley, the Great Plains, and the northern boreal forest to come fight on their behalf when they face off with the British. That's a lot to get in for one day. We're going to talk about these key concepts. You're reading about the Feast of the Dead, which is one response to the massive disruption and dislocation of the fur trade, and you're also going to read about Daniel Duluth, who tries to solve a murder, and then you're going to read an article by Richard Wright talking about these concepts. I will see you in class. Thank you.